The personal relationship between Elizabeth Woodville and Richard III is one of the most momentous of the English late Middle Ages, particularly during the Wars of the Roses. The conflict between their respective factions led to the dramatic events of 1483, including the mysterious circumstances surrounding the princes in the Tower. These events seem to occur unexpectedly and suddenly, but the sequence of events suggests otherwise. While it goes beyond the scope of this video to recount the story of the princes in detail, which I've extensively covered on my channel, I will highlight two examples indicating that Elizabeth and Richard had a problematic relationship. After the death of Edward IV, the Woodville faction, led by the Queen, attempted to revoke his last wish for his brother Richard to serve as Lord Protector during Edward V's minority. Richard intercepted Edward V, who was traveling to London, and arrested Elizabeth's brother Anthony and her son Richard. Both were executed less than 2 months later. It is evident that the two parties were not only distrustful, but also openly hostile towards each other, even before the drama surrounding the princes. This hostility can be interpreted in two ways. First, the factions may have always been poised to eliminate each other given the opportunity. Anne Sutton and Livia Vissefux poignantly state in an essay for the Richard III Society, if Richard III is usually cast as the wicked uncle of the Yorkist dynasty, it is Elizabeth Woodville who plays the evil queen. Alternatively, the relationship between the Queen and the then Duke of Gloucester may have been problematic for a long time, rather than changing suddenly overnight. Surprisingly, no historical work has thoroughly analyzed the Queen's relationship with her stepbrother. In this video, I can only address the topic in a somewhat superficial manner, relying largely on primary sources published in printed form. A more in-depth archive search would be highly valuable. My remarks will primarily focus on the period before 1483, but will also touch on the years of escalation from 1483 to 1485. This analysis will provide a better understanding of, for example, why Elizabeth Woodville eventually emerged from sanctuary and entrusted her daughters to the care of Richard III. Edward IV established the framework for the relationship between his younger brother Richard and his wife, Elizabeth Woodville. His style of government, known as personal rule, concentrated power strongly in the ruler's hands. He governed through personal networks loyal to him, rather than to the institution he represented, thus establishing a patronage system. Members of these networks were directly dependent on him for their advancement. For instance, Edward won the throne with the support of his cousin, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, who earned the title Kingmaker and stood outside the classic political hierarchy of England for some time. As Edward's right-hand man, Warwick saw himself as a co-king. When Edward ceased to follow Warwick's commands, which were disguised as advice, Warwick became an immediate enemy of the monarch. Another example involves the Woodville family. With Edward's blessing, Elizabeth married many of her relatives into the high nobility. The consequences of this were long-lasting. For example, Lady Jane Grey was a direct descendant of Elizabeth Woodville through her son Thomas Grey, from her first marriage to John Grey. This marriage created a power block within the elite, whose position depended directly on Elizabeth's marriage to Edward. Edward tried to balance different power blocks directly dependent on him. Besides the Woodvilles and Warwicks, he built up groups of office holders whom he particularly privileged. One of the leading figures was Edward's childhood friend, William Hastings, who served as Lord Chamberlain. As long as Edward lived, he could regulate the competitive behavior of these blocks. For example, although Elizabeth frequently complained to her husband about Hastings' favoritism, it had no consequences. Edward sorted those around him into these power blocks. Richard is a prime example. He was purposefully groomed to be the successor to the Kingmaker. Warwick, who had only two daughters, Isabel and Anne, trained Richard as a knight. Richard lived in Warwick's household for several years and was likely intended to marry one of the daughters to keep the extensive Warwick estate within the crown's reach. Edward even paid Warwick £1,000 for Richard's training in 1465. After Henry VI's brief restoration, Richard not only married Anne Neville, but was also appointed to a role akin to Governor of the North. While historians debate the extent of Richard's special position in the North, it is undisputed that he was Edward's strong man there and extremely loyal to him. Edward's secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville on May 1st, 1464, was by no means prompted by the ardour of youth, as stated in the Crowland Chronicle. He made a non-aristocratic family that had served the Lancaster side directly dependent on him. Publicly announcing this project would have likely doomed it, as the English elite unanimously rejected the connection to Elizabeth. For instance, Dominic Mancini, who was no friend of the Queen, noted that the magnates disdained to show royal honours towards an undistinguished woman promoted to such exalted rank. Mancini also reported that Elizabeth was aware that, according to the established usage, she was not the legitimate wife of the king. As long as Edward lived, this did not matter. However, it underscores a central factor in Edward's system. All loyalties had to be to him alone. Warwick needed a king as a co-king. Richard, as a strong man in the north, depended on Edward's backing, and Edward had to protect the Woodvilles from the high nobility. Any independent loyalties would pose a threat. For Warwick, there was no turning back after he had put Henry VI back on the throne. As a side note, Edward kept George, Duke of Clarence, out of these power blocks. George, the heir to the throne for years, was not allowed to become too powerful in England. Edward preferred to marry George abroad, as an internal connection that generated loyalty independent of him went against his plans. This is one reason Edward V vehemently opposed George's marriage to Isabel Neville. During Edward's lifetime, this system proved successful. Even when Warwick bonded with George, Edward had enough support to prevail. However, to maintain peace after his death, the power blocks needed to communicate, a task made extremely difficult by Edward himself. Elizabeth was 15 to 20 years older than Richard, who was about the same age as her sons from her first marriage. At the beginning of her time as queen, Elizabeth didn't just see her brother-in-law as a child. He was one. It is not clear when the two first met, but it might have been at Elizabeth's coronation on May 16, 1465. One report mentions the royal family following the new queen in the procession, which would include Richard. George, however, had a ceremonial role in the coronation and was given special mention. Richard, 12 years old at the time, might have played a similar role, which would have been noteworthy. Given the controversy surrounding Elizabeth's rise to queen, it would be surprising if an important family member like Richard stayed away from the event. Elizabeth and Richard are recorded together in a source from 1472. After Edward's return to the throne, the two are celebrated in poems of thanksgiving. Richard, who had become the Duke of Gloucester at age 6, was praised as a husband of fortune and a gentile knight, which failed his maester nother in storm ne stour. Elizabeth was commended for remaining in London in church asylum with the people while Henry VI was back on the throne, even giving birth to the heir to the throne there. She was implored, "Help every man to have justice." These lines were likely York propaganda, describing how Edward saw his brother and wife, Richard as his warrior and Elizabeth as a focal point for the people who could appeal to her for justice. This was a traditional role for the Queen of England. On the surface, the two did not interfere with each other. This impression is reinforced by the fact that Elizabeth's brother Anthony served under Richard. When Henry came back to power, Edward, Richard, and Anthony fled to the mainland together. If Richard was hostile to the Woodvilles, he set it aside for his brother at that time. The Woodvilles, in turn, supported Richard in his quest to marry Anne Neville, weakening George, who remained an enemy of the Queen for the rest of his life. Edward then separated his wife and brother. Richard was given a significant position in the north and acted as Edward's direct deputy there. However, Richard was notably absent as an executor in Edward's will of 1475, while Elizabeth and Hastings were named, with the Queen coming first. This suggests the influence of the Queen. There is also debate over whether Edward removed Elizabeth as an executor in his will of 1483, but since the will is lost and the Queen was in church asylum, this cannot be confirmed. 3 years later, George was executed. He had repeatedly complained about the Woodvilles and accused the Queen's mother of witchcraft. After being banned from marrying Mary of Burgundy, he exerted undue pressure on the courts in several cases, forcing Edward to act. Legend has it that George was drowned in a barrel of Malvasia wine on February 18, 1478. Richard was not present at George's execution, as he was in the north. According to Mancini, Richard swore revenge, blaming the Queen's family for his brother's death. Elizabeth likely felt strengthened by this event, helping many family members to gain new titles. However, Richard's sphere of influence remained closed to her. It is plausible that she began to perceive him as a threat at this time. Richard was not only politically untouchable for her, but also posed a potential threat similar to George, who had previously declared Edward and Elizabeth's marriage invalid. Richard could make similar claims, jeopardizing her position. Since he was rarely at court, the Queen could not assess him personally. Elizabeth also resented Edward appointing both her family members and Richard to the Council of Wales and the Marches, which was responsible for teaching her son, Edward V, in statesmanship. This indicated that Edward intended for his brother to play a role in the future king's life, a prospect that must have seemed threatening to the Queen after her experiences with George. Additionally, there were personal conflicts. Her son Thomas and Richard had issues over a mistress, ensuring that the few personal contacts between the Woodvilles and Richard were problematic. During Edward's lifetime, this system proved successful. Even when Warwick bonded with George, Edward had enough support to prevail. To understand Richard's perspective, it is important to consider how Elizabeth Woodville entered his life. She belonged to the Lancaster camp, responsible for his father's death, and came from a lower-class family. In a society that paid close attention to rank, this significantly influenced how she was perceived. Richard grew up with Warwick, who despised Elizabeth Woodville. He likely heard many negative things about the new Queen, especially since other family members also disliked her. His mother Cecily detested her, as did his brother George. This raises the question of whether Richard tolerated Elizabeth and her family out of loyalty to the king, but never actually liked them. Richard likely resented the Woodvilles' marriages into the high nobility. He had to struggle to marry Anne Neville, while allies like Henry Stafford, who were forced to marry Woodvilles, hated their married lives. From Richard's point of view, it must have seemed as if his father's killers, who were of lower status, were suddenly part of the family and given politically important roles. Mancini writes that the Queen attracted to her party many strangers and introduced them to court so that they alone should manage the public and private business of the crown, surround the king, and have bands of retainers give or sell offices, and finally rule the very king himself. Richard, therefore, not only came from an environment hostile to the Woodvilles, but also experienced what he saw as a hostile takeover. George's execution likely played a key role in cementing Richard's enmity towards the Queen. It wasn't just about the loss of his brother, but also the realization that his close kinship with the king was no longer enough to ensure his safety. Richard was too powerful to be ignored, and therefore posed a significant problem for the Woodvilles. Moreover, the heir to the throne was half Woodville. If he supported his mother's family, Richard would lack the means to defend himself. The fact that the Woodville-dominated Privy Council tried to have Edward V crowned so quickly in 1483, after Edward IV's death, that Richard would not even have time to come to London from the north, was for him the final proof that the Queen was one of his enemies and was taking action against him. Let's return to the breaking point of 1483. In principle, what happened was the worst nightmare for both the Queen and Richard. Edward IV intended to make his brother Lord Protector to maintain a counterweight to the Woodville power block, giving Richard a relatively free hand to weaken the family. Meanwhile, the Queen wanted to control the new king and thus break the balance of power. A quote from Thomas More, which he attributes to Richard, suddenly makes a lot of sense. However, a great peril is growing if we suffer this young king to remain in our enemy's hand, who, without the king's awareness, might abuse the name of his commandment to any of our undoing, which thing God and good provision forbid. And of such good provision, none of us has anything the less need, because of the late-made atonement, in which the king's pleasure had more place than the party's wills. Nor none of us, I believe, is so unwise to trust too soon a new friend made of an old foe, or to think that a slight kindness, suddenly contracted in 1 hour, continued yet scant a fortnight, should be deeper settled in their stomachs than a long accustomed malice many years rooted. If Richard indeed said this, he speaks of many years of malice and warns against trusting the other party too lightly. Mancini reports an exchange of words in Stony Stratford between Edward V and Henry Stafford, where Stafford allegedly said that governing is not women's business. If we interpret this in light of the Queen's desire to control her son, this statement gains significance. Richard, however, was the first to resort to violence by arresting Richard Grey and Anthony Woodville. Richard and Stafford probably believed they were protecting the young king from harm, as these men were aligned with the Queen. Elizabeth, on the other hand, saw this as a direct attack on her and her family's safety, making her flight to Church Asylum understandable. Both sides likely believed the other was trying to kill them. Richard is said to have openly voiced this concern multiple times, even reviving the old accusation of witchcraft. This raises the question of why Elizabeth entrusted her second son to her brother-in-law. It should be noted that another party was involved, the Church. The Archbishop of Canterbury guaranteed her son's safety. Elizabeth might have assumed that Richard would eventually break Church Asylum if she didn't surrender her son, but with the Church's protection, her son might have had a chance. By declaring Edward and Elizabeth's marriage invalid through the Parliamentary Act of Titulus Regius, Richard not only secured the throne, but also had the opportunity to destroy the Woodville's power base. He executed leading family members and confiscated their property. Feeling cornered, Elizabeth conspired with Margaret Beaufort, and the two women likely spearheaded the Buckingham Rebellion in the autumn of 1483. After the rebellion failed, Elizabeth was utterly defeated. Richard played another trump card. In January 1484, Parliament confiscated the former Queen's last possessions, leaving her and her daughters destitute. It didn't matter whether Elizabeth trusted Richard or thought he had killed her sons. She had to make peace with him to secure a future for her daughters. Richard's oath in Parliament is extremely revealing. I, Richard, in the presence of you, my Lord Spiritual and Temporal, and you, my Lord Mayor and Alderman of London, promise and swear that if the daughters of Elizabeth will come to me out of the sanctuary of Westminster and be guided, ruled, and demeaned after me, then I shall see that they shall be in surety of their lives, nor any of them imprisoned in the Tower of London or other prison, but that I shall put them into honest places. Thus, the king publicly guaranteed the lives of the girls, promising not to imprison them in the Tower and to find suitable husbands for them, referred to as honest places. Elizabeth was also granted an annual pension of 700 marks. Richard could do this because he had won the conflict with his sister-in-law, at least in appearance. She seemingly had no means left to pose a threat to him, and he optimistically assumed this would not change. He was wrong. You don't just want to see or hear this as a video, you also want to read it? Then I have good news. This script is available to my members via the Community tab. This costs 99 cents per month, and there is now also a fairly extensive back catalogue. In any case, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe to support the channel.